Michael, thanks for coming. All right, I will be quiet now and turn it over to you. What is it?
Now I'm curious. Let's see.
Let's see.
Jar of honey, I think.
Sounds. No, it's light. It's light. I was kind of hoping it was heavier. Really well tied together. No, I just, let's see. All right. This would be pencils,
Right, yes.
pebbles.
Right.
Yeah.
Water.
Drinking water. Oh, speaking of water, is there a glass? Could I have a glass of water?
Yeah,
Like a, yeah, or even this. Could put it in this.
I'll grab you something.
Okay. All right. I think I'm gonna work here. This probably sounds pretty good, everybody. So for that back row, do I need to be in closer or not really? Like this is good. Okay. Well, my name is Michael Earl Craig, and I am. I thought it, rather than just I'm going to break up. Typically, I would give a reading and just read a group of poems, and maybe there would be a Q&A at the end, and maybe not. But today, I think what I'm going to do is some of that, but I'm also going to break it up with just some talking about poetry and my background and things like that. But first, I guess I will start off with a poem or two, just this is from my first book, which came out in 2002, called Can You Relax in My House? Raindrops streak the window like they do in the movies. A paint flake fell on her forehead. A cardboard box full of punctured tennis balls made a long shadow. Across the street, a bird ate a bagel on a park bench. A machine hummed from within shrubbery. The rain was in delay. She stood up to dim the lights. She adjusted a framed portrait of 2 dewdrops. The portrait covered a buttonhole. She never understood that. She was up now. She made a pot of coffee. Another paint flake fell into one of her shoes, which were over by the window. Who was it who first said no and dumped their plate of spaghetti into the pool dotted with paper swans? Who was it who sat up in bed, looked out the window and wrote, "The tops of tall buildings are enshrouded in mist," and then laughed? Who said hell is other people? Who first said maybe, reaching up to let the air out? This book was originally accepted, the manuscript, under a different title, which was shorter, and I won't tell you what it is, but it was shorter and had a little more punch to it, more direct. And then later I decided I wanted to change shouldn't be a big deal, right? Change the manuscript, the book title. But it was my first book and new press, and I was really just grateful to have the thing happening. So I kind of got off to on the wrong foot by saying, oh, by the way, I want to call it Can You Relax in My House? And so it was a mild threat at first, like, well, wait a minute, we didn't accept that book, that title, and we did this and we did that. We really liked the other title, and then they didn't. And then, so anyway, it was sort of a rocky. In the end, It's a longer title. There's no question mark on the end, and it is a question, and it engages a reader. And so it's kind of complicated, and I've had this book title butchered over and over by different people. My mom included for years. She would say, won't you please sit down in my house? What is it again? Anyway, so if you're going to get a book published, just pick a nice short, tight title and stick with it. This is called Hand Polished. You were at that round table in the sun. Why did you move? I said, why'd you move? You were at that nice table in the sun. You were just at that table. I said, why'd you move, damn it? You were in the sun. The old man says nothing. The waitress begins choking him. The table is shaking. The waitress has reached across the table to throttle the old man, which causes to topple a salt shaker from the table. You were just at that table. The old man is sheet white. Each of his hands is like a big clay hand, beside its spoon, beside its fork and knife. I gather up my stuff and go over and sit down at the round table. It's very bright. I remove my sweater, my eyes closed, and flap blackly over apple country. Did that glass of water just come in here? Oh, that's the sink right here. Okay. Sorry. Okay, so I'll read a couple more earlier poems, and then this is called Because of Roy. Roy could move a lot of sheep. He moved them off the mountain with his arms outstretched at 40-degree angles. Thank you. Roy never spoke. He wore navy corduroys. This annoyed some of the guys. He walked like a foster child, stepping carefully and sometimes robotically. The sheep respected this. They kept their mouths shut for once and flowed down, down in a tight and docile band over the uneven terrain because of Roy. And this is for my uncle who has since passed away, but he passed away a couple years ago, but this poem is way older than that. And he had some eye issues going on. And I remember speaking with him on the phone, and he was telling me about the discrepancy between his two eyes and how it was giving him a lot of grief. And I was trying to listen to him. I was listening to him, but I was also taking notes, And this poem is for him. It's called Right Eye is Hampered. Right eye is lazy, flickering. Left eye taking over, getting lively. Brain senses right eye in trouble. Brain knows right eye more capable than this. It's like left eye takes right turn, gets out in front of right eye. Brain doesn't like this. Brain wants each eye to do its job. Left eye just keeps getting out in front. Left eye is too cocky, even as right eye perks up a bit. Brain is obsessed with these details. Mind is sort of broken away from brain. It's actually always been this way. Brain is very clear. Mind is not so clear. Not always in the moment, not always receiving input from eyes, and therefore not watching baby anymore. Not aware of baby at all. To its credit, left eye has taken baby into account. It's right eye we're all worried about. My new glass. And I brought some floss too, if anybody needs a. That is Poet Laureate floss that I carry around with me. Okay, so I did my undergraduate here in Missoula between 1990 and 94. And my interest in, I'm just going to give a little background at this point. My interest in writing started with journalism in my late teens. And I also took a great class on essay writing. And I came across Wendell Berry, Joan Didion, John McPhee, Edward Abbey, Margaret Atwood, and a lot of those writers were also gateways to different people like Emerson and Thoreau, and just it was I really started out writing thinking that essay writing, nonfiction writing, was kind of what I wanted to do, and the journalism also was kind of weirdly important to me because they just kind of pounded it into you, trained you to think about economy and being concise and taking a big block of text and making it smaller and tighter, but including everything. Edward Abbey in particular, I think, stood out for me. His essays more than the fiction. He was definitely a hero and a role model for me. And sometimes I tell this to people now, and they don't see the connection at all. They're sort of surprised. But I read Edward Abbey when I was still in Ohio, as a teenager, before I ever really came west. And recently I realized I think that Edward Abbey is maybe why I started to think about it and then moved to Montana. So only recently did all of this come to mind. Somebody was talking to me about Edward Abbey, and I pulled some old books off the shelf, and I started to think about how this one essay writer unlocked this love of language and created these paths to different writers. But then eventually I ended up doing something totally different with my own writing. But in hindsight, the journalism and essay writing pounded in that economy of language. I remember William Zinsser in this really dry book called On Writing Well. It wasn't that dry, but maybe some of you know that book, On Writing Well. But I think the quote was, clear writing is clear thinking, I think. And that idea that, I can write so much better than I can sometimes think. It feels that way. And I don't know if anyone else feels that way, but when I'm having trouble with what I think about something, writing about it is always the place where I go. Also, Wallace Stevens, the poem must resist the intelligence almost successfully, which doesn't have a whole lot to do on the surface with William Zinsser's quote, but I'm going to come back to that later. I love that. The poem must resist the intelligence almost successfully. All my fiction writing teachers here at the university pretty much were sweeping me out the door pretty quickly because my stories were chiseled, image-driven, too short, no plot, no narrative, no dialogue. You don't know what you're doing. Just go down the hall and look for the poetry teachers. But I think it was all really valuable. And a couple other things. So the bridge for me was Raymond Carver, I think. I loved Raymond Carver. I wanted to be a fiction writer. He also wrote poetry. I started to look at his poetry, and he sort of functioned for me as a little a bridge over this to see how I could maybe do that. And I remember reading a collection of his called Aquamarine. I think that's what it's called. And so Raymond Carver was instrumental for me to see that. I've never put a lot of emphasis on the distinctions really between prose and poetry, though, having said all of that. Good prose always flirts with poetry. All my favorite novelists really have a very poetic core to them. I've read all the books of Cormac McCarthy, and they're just loaded with just rich, beautiful, dense language. And he's a very brave fiction writer. You know, he's not always taking everybody by the hand through every single room. So good prose is always flirting with poetry, and my favorite poetry always or almost always stabs directly and cleanly, and sometimes has a narrative drive to it. So I'm going to read a couple of those poems. This is speaking of the narrative drive in poetry. The Sorensen effect. I read this poem a few years ago in Livingston, and a fiction writer came up to me afterward and said, he was a fascinating person. You know, he started talking about this character Sorensen, but I had made this person up. This is not a real person, but this fiction writer was convinced that it was sort of funny. It's like, no, this is a fictitious person. Sorensen was a professor of philosophy, the author of 32 books and hundreds of published articles and critical reviews, a bachelor, twice nominated for a Nobel Prize, and the recipient of countless other awards in both philosophy and the humanities. Sorensen lived like an outcast, with his exceptionally thick white beard, which many felt housed both his brain and his soul. When you looked at Sorensen, it was this beard that you saw. Later, you'd find yourself incapable of describing his face or his voice. This beard was always dusty and often had some oatmeal or a strip of bacon in it. One day, Sorensen had a surprise visitor, a young woman who traveled a great distance to meet her hero after 8 months of unreturned letters and phone calls. Sorensen was almost blind. His place was a wreck. Dishes in the sink, a filthy tub and toilet, stacks of books and yellowed magazines blocking hallways and completely overtaking the screened-in porch. Sorensen was oblivious. He asked this young woman to finally chop a 3-pound bag of almonds. The young woman, it turned out, was very good at this. Despite his terrible eyesight, Sorensen could safely say he'd never seen such a neat and rapidly growing pile, at which point he asked the young woman to remove his beard, to please shave his beard completely off. The young woman stopped chopping. She wiped her hands on a dirty towel and began collecting her things, her coat and her backpack. She was shocked and a little scared. But Sorensen was somehow able to convince her not only to stay, to put down her coat and bag, but to carry out his wishes, and in no time at all, he had seated himself in a chair before the young woman. As Sorensen joked and chatted amiably, the young woman used electric sheep clippers from beneath the sink, and in a fairly steady hand, she made 10 or 11 downward passes, the clippers vibrating confidently, and soon the beard lay in ruin all about Sorensen's lap and feet. He looked like a plucked chicken. He looked suddenly cold and smaller and a little younger. His eyes looked milky in the late afternoon light. He sat as if tied to the chair. He was ready for some ice cream. Over 30 years have passed, and this woman has never recovered from shaving Sorensen. They'd eaten some ice cream and parted company politely. Sorensen was found years later, dead in his garden, a smile on his face just beneath the carefully waxed handlebar mustache. But by that time, the young woman had completely lost track of Sorensen's activity, as well as those of friends and family. Soon she was incapable of making a salad or combing her hair. She's been sitting in this chair, camera moves in on the woman, beside this window for at least a decade now, oboe and clarinet. It is a strange and wondrous world we live in, but this is no time for platitudes. And I'll read one one more along those lines from this book. Bubbles came from their noses. This was triggered by a photograph in the newspaper in Bozeman. It was an underground photograph of a synchronized swimming class, kind of looked to me like, I don't know, yoga, maybe underwater yoga or something, I don't know. But it was really an eerie photograph, and everybody was underwater, photographer and all the bubbles came from their noses. He wasn't supposed to be there. This is how any number of poems begin. He had his goggles and his nose plugs. He was underwater and pretending to be fixing a ladder bolted to the side of the pool. The participants in the synchronized swimming workshop eyed him cautiously. Each of them had her arms out like Christ on the cross, and they hovered near the bottom, but not on the bottom. And this was what fascinated him. Many of the swimmers had their palms turned slightly up, their arms bent a bit at the elbows, and this gave them the appearance of those carefully weighing something. Two things, I suppose, perhaps pitting one thing against another, but in a fair and emotionless manner, and this made them seem to him both judgmental and blasé, which he liked. There were over 24 of them. Their hands pendulated a little. This trued them. The colors of the pool were deep blue and turquoise, with shafts of gold light in spots. And the swimmers farthest from him looked ghostly, like faded blueprints of swimmers. It was calm down there, serene. He heard an occasional dull clanking from he didn't know where. Bubbles came from their noses. They eyed him cautiously. And then one of them, a chubby one, she appeared to be the leader. She made her move. Her chest was forward, her shoulders back. She was squinting. Her goggles were clear and seemed part of her head. She began to move out ahead of the group. He sensed a slight buzz in the water. She reminded him of a seahorse. She was expressionless. She moved as if she had a little motor behind her. She came right at the man, slowly and with an eerie purpose. I guess on the other side of the more narrative drive would be this. I think with poetry, a lot of people I don't know if anybody happened to see this. Jimmy Kimmel, is that a talk show host? Jimmy Kimmel. So a friend of mine, Chris Murray, sent me this link where he's interviewing Bill Murray, and he asks him about your favorite poetry, and it. And in this little clip, Bill Murray, it's recent, he mentions Lucille Clifton and Jim Harrison, who just passed away recently. And but Jimmy Kimmel's so surprised that poetry's still alive. There's this thing that isn't it dead yet? There's a little bit of that going on. Like he tells Bill Murray that in general, I don't really like poetry. I don't ever go to it. But this stuff you've collected here, this stuff is good. It's like it's a big mystery that interesting poetry exists, and but I think part of it is that a lot of poetry does veer away maybe from the narrative impulse, a narrative drive, and it seems less accessible. And so while I was watching this, I was thinking about how I definitely like both types of poetry. These two poems I just read here are basically almost like short stories. But I want to read there's a quote that'll sort of move me toward this. There's a Wittgenstein was asked at one point what he thought of Georg Trakhl's poetry, and these two men would have been peers, and one's a philosopher, the other one was a poet, and they were probably working at the same time. Trakhl ended up dying not very long after that. But Wittgenstein says, "I do not understand it," meaning I don't understand. I'm an internationally known philosopher, but I don't understand this man's poetry. But its tone delights me. It is a tone of a true genius, and I love this. I came across this quote a long time ago, but this idea that in poetry you have these two things, tone and content. And why can we come across a poem or a body of poetry that speaks to us and moves us, but also, back to Stevens, resists the intelligence? Maybe it seems even more than a little bit successfully. But I've always loved that, how a poem that we can't really explain, we don't even really know what we'd say, what it means, but tonally it hangs together. So I wanted to work on some poems that would sort of crack me, force me to work away from the narrative poems. And I'll read some of those. And another thing that pertains to this is I love this idea of using material that seems to fall outside of the realm of poetry. So for a lot of times, we have this, part of why I think poetry can be boring to people is because sometimes we as poets look for these heavy, important subjects, and we move toward that, and that's interesting. But one game I like to play with myself is to pick something that just seems unlikely to ever be in a poem. Even that when I look at the subject, I'll hear something on the news, read it in the paper, eavesdrop. I'll see something in a film, and it just seems like that's not the stuff of poetry. And then I'll try to challenge myself. And so this poem kicks off with a line, which is, I'll read this poem. Bob sucked the golf ball through the garden hose reluctantly. Dot said she had toe danced her entire way through college. I had my head down, I was thinking. A hand reached casually into my field of vision. The waiter touched my fries with his Band-Aid. Baby chicks stepped into the clubhouse. Each one tripped a bit on the rug's edge. No one stopped them. Bob sucked a second golf ball through in half the time. Dot held one of her ankles beside her head like a swan song. The season unbuttoned itself in little burps of pink and white. They fed the racehorse pot brownies in his stall. He ate them thoughtfully. The jockey fondled his heavy snaffle. It rained only over Roanoke, which I guess is why I've asked you here. So, I've heard this from different people, something about sucking a golf ball through a garden hose, and it's not a new line that just sort of went into my head thanks to somebody, and then it's in there forever. It's like this trapped bit of language, and it was like, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to start a poem with that. But basically, this whole series, I'm working on a series of these, and the idea is that they're in two 6-line stanzas, and I can repeat. So in this case, it's Bob sucked the golf ball through the garden hose reluctantly. That's line 1, and then line 7 is Bob sucked a second golf ball through in half the time. So I get a chance to revise, to restate, to try it again. And then the second line, which is Dot said she had toe danced her entire way through college. I get a chance to work with that line again. Dot held one of her ankles beside her head like a swan song. But beyond that, every other line is supposed to, the rule that I set for myself is that I cannot follow any other repeats. I can't move into any kind of a narrative or repetitive place. So the poems risk that random word salad. You know, these are, people say, oh, poetry is just a big word salad. But back to Wittgenstein, these poems, I'm trying really hard to have them cohere tonally. So these are tone-driven poems where I've sort of tied my hands behind my back to a degree, and I have to work outside this comfort zone. Here's another one. Some vulgar conversation was coming from the hedge. I stood in the garage a long time, washing the punching bag. The runaway horse came back. He let himself into the yard, latching the gate behind him. A barber called Carl ran a finger through gold pollen on the hood of the hearse. A tinted window opened 1 inch, briefly, then closed. Some vulgar conversation blew delicately in from Alabama. Throughout the 70s, all punching bags were carefully stuffed with daisies at the factory.
Would Amanda McGinnis please come to the front desk? Amanda McGinnis, thank you.
Knowing what I know now, it's hard to pretend I know less or more. A nut-bearing tree elicits mixed reviews. A blue hatchet waits for spring. Sister Helen unslams the rectory door, looking refreshed. I sat on the edge of the bathtub, feeling extorted. The Percheron carefully worked his lips, loosening his tether. A screech owl stepped quietly through the courtyard. I'd completed law school using nothing but body language. It seemed a cipher separated the piglets from their mothers. In the past, it was primarily vents that were made out of denim. I went over and sat on the toilet, feeling no different. A time when Percherons were still tied to the sides of churches. A woman named Sue worked the guillotine, and an ordinary hairpin fell through centuries from the side of her head. We could see now how the mountain was composed of fine print. Assumptive was what you said. I did not say assumptive. The physician was frank. His nose was red and large. Scientists had discovered nerve endings in a manure pile. Just the very tip of a barren tree branch tapped occasionally on the study window. Joy said there was a rupture in her maple bar, pointing to a hairline crack in its surface. Hans had to stroke a cat in order to write a poem. To the physician, his beer can felt cold, open, and heavy. The manure pile emitted a steady, uninterrupted moan. I will play the wet cat. You will come at me with a towel. There will be an idling car, windows partially fogged. Horses will approach, first one and then another, to try looking in, big eyes scanning for Betsy. It is autumn and another apostle is blown into town. The public pool has been drained, its cracked bottom not as blue as we'd remembered. Our peace pipes, grown so heavy with baggage, can in fact barely lift mine, but finally manage to swing it. You throw your back out, swinging yours, saying, "You'll knock my face in," laughing. No one can see past the new apostle's chapped lips. Due to such a violent draining, we lost a few children. Yesterday's belting left Bruce gumming his gazpacho, a second bowl of it skidding past me at the lunch counter. I retraced my steps, smelling shampoo on the meter maid. The collie's mood darkened. It was not fond of walnuts. Okay, so I'm not sure why I'm kind of I've just recently been thinking about this distinction between prose and prose writers and poets, but part of it is maybe because of this Poet Laureate post. I have a lot of people in Livingston, which is kind of a lively literary town, really, for it is. And I keep getting from the fiction crowd, I just was recently in Los Angeles and I recorded Talkativeness in its entirety in a miniature theater that seated 17 people, and it was like a ornate red velvet curtains and real chairs. It was a tiny 17-person theater. And when the reading started, they closed the door. You couldn't come and go. It was sort of like extreme, like rock climbing, or there's like an extreme poetry feel to this event. Once you came in, you better have whatever you want while you're in there. Your water, your floss, because it's a recording session, so you can't get up and come and go. And then you just read the entire book. But anyway, I ran this by a fiction writer in Livingston, and the first thing out of his mouth was, "I hope you have the royalties to that." And it had never even occurred to me. Not only do I not know about the royalties, but it never even crossed my mind. And so I remember being in the fiction workshops here 25 years ago, and the talk about the market and editors and readers and everything was very important. And so I do think that that's interesting, that there's this. It's always interested me how maybe poets too much, maybe we blow off some of this important stuff, which is, I don't know about the market, but the idea of the reader. So this narrative versus non-narrative subject has been on my mind a little bit, and I guess I will. I think what I'll do is read one more poem that sort of functions in that same way, and then I'll maybe finish with some newer poems. This one was, I was driving to Boise, Idaho for a writing event or conference, and they put me up in this room, and I was I texted a friend of mine and said, I'm in this room, I have a typewriter, a bicycle, and I have a lot of time. And he sent me 12 words and said, go ahead and write a poem, based on, using these words. I had more time than I probably wanted to have. So I wrote this poem. It's called I'm in Room 927. And the words, I believe, are ball-peen hammer, sparrow, night, burlap, zinc, mind, forest, girlhood, indigo bunting, kiln, attention, and orphan. But I guess part of what this presentation is about is also just maybe show to somebody that there are all different ways of writing poems. Sometimes I'm writing in a storytelling narrative mode, and sometimes I'm just working with a pile of words like a sculptor would work with a blob of clay or something like that. But anyway, I'm in room 927. With thumb and forefinger, I examine carefully the ball-peen hammer. The sparrow slid violently into third base. Night after night it was NASCAR, kettle corn, karaoke. Wendy wore burlap, clapping her hands. Zinc divided the men from the boys. My mind made a snuffling noise. The forest absorbed us, knowing all along. Peg slid her girlhood toward us across the ages. When I say indigo bunting, I fucking mean indigo bunting. The kiln was a metaphor Joan was fond of. The greased hog loved the attention. The orphan snapped me in the balls with his towel. The lump in Jim's pants was his ball-peen hammer. The sparrow was a piece of meat with wings. Night laid us all face down naked in the grass and flossed us. Wearing burlap, Wendy stepped into the phone booth. Brad had a funny little zinc limp. My mind drank from its tank. The forest was full of gongs. Girlhood down the chimney. Did I not say indigo bunting? Joan talked on and on about the kiln, gesturing. I stood at attention, which many felt unnecessary. The orphan recommended the steak tartare. A ball-peen hammer was spending the century at the bottom of Lake Baikal. The sparrow swept crumbs with one wing, bitch slapped the cat with the other, Night with some spit on his chin. Wendy allowed herself to be shot from a cannon wearing burlap. It was zinc that they found in our long johns. My mind was standing on one of its reins. Don't believe what you're told in a forest. Girlhood tore the Shih Tzu a new one. Kurt stepped a little too honestly from his robe of indigo bunting. We decided the kiln had a vagina and searched for it. You suggested I pay attention. I cried out to the orphan, to all orphans. With vintage 80s pigeon shit, the ball-peen hammer had been carefully caked. The sparrow was wall-eyed. He looked at Denise coldly. Night was crawling toward me like some kind of injured kitten. If it looks, feels, and smells like burlap, it still could be canvas. The bar top was made of zinc. The gerbil sensed this. My mind kicked twice at the stall wall. Jim walked into his closet as if it were a forest. The chapter on girlhood upset us. All the November babies had been swaddled in indigo bunting. I set my beer on Joan's kiln and she smacked me. Attention is what we will pay to this trumpet, she said, hiccuping. The nightjar was an orphan and sat in the highest branches. Rewinding carefully, the police watched over and over what Wanda's lips did when she said ball-peen hammer. The sparrow ate pulled pork for 50 minutes. Night foamed at the mouth for the fun of it. They say Christ wore both socks and a shoulder bag made of burlap. We ran through the museum, sucking zinc lozenges. Someone dressed as a nun said, "You have broken my mind," into her omelet. When they slid open the unicorn, it was full of forests. Girlhood stopped the mowers from idling in the lilac. I asked to have only indigo bunting pulled over my eyes. The kiln is loose now and alone and rolls unsteadily across town. Jim is demonstrating what heightened attention looks like. The orphan can only play the Liszt sonatas with a paper bag over her head. Okay, I think what I'm going to do is finish with a couple newer poems. Well, some of these were newer poems, but really newer poems, and then we'll do a Q&A, or like some questions if there are any. Over in the Paradise Valley, we have this problem going on where there's the Lucky Mine out of Canada is trying to put a gold mine up behind Chico. And I'm one of what I do for a living is I shoe horses. I'm a full-time professional farrier, and so I have some clients in that valley, and some of them are ranchers, and one of them was assuring me that not to worry because first the gold mine will be great jobs, and then it also will be right over that hill. Just, we won't be able to see it from down here where we all live. It's not possible that it could affect anything down on the Yellowstone River, for example. And so some people are trying to put together an anthology. There's a call put out for writers to respond in some way. And I know Rick Bass and Doug Peacock and Terry Tempest Williams and different people are putting their pieces in, I'm told. And I just felt like I'm out of my league, I mean, I don't know. I don't have anything to add, really. I mean, I don't know what to say. So I was trying to get around it. Didn't want to. I don't really write a whole lot of occasional poems like that, but they kept hitting me with emails and saying, you really need to do this. So I'll read this poem. This is what I've sent to them. I don't know if they're going to take it or not, but I finally decided I can't write a prose piece and have it be any good. I decided I'm just going to do what I think I know do better. So this is called Town. Town was holding its annual pageant down by the river. Floats and kettle corn, clowns, horns, stuff like that. The first float came into view, not really a float. It was a men's plaid sport coat, just floating down the river toward us, face down with arms akimbo. It rippled noiselessly past us. For a few minutes, nothing happened. Then came the Shriners, swimming in white underwear, hats above water, yelping, struggling. A couple of them disappeared beneath the surface. Then it was quiet. Nothing happened. Probably 5 minutes passed. Then a homemade-looking raft with a slippery-looking hog on it came into view. The hog was covered with brown spots. "Leeches," someone shouted. People laughed. Not everyone. No one was sure. "It's a greased hog on a raft with maybe leeches," someone said. "It's not grease," someone said. "It's maybe sunscreen," someone said. Those leeches aren't biting," said a man holding a stiff slice of pizza. The river sparkled. Big trucks moved ant-like up a mountain in the distance, belching blue puffs. "If those are leeches," said a young mother holding her baby, "I say they're friendly leeches." "Leeches ain't always evil," said another. Then the baby, who was maybe 6 months old, said, "Opportunistic leeches." He blinked, working his fingers. "That's our greased hog." His voice was deep and calm. "Covered with opportunistic leeches." So there's that. My annual Christmas poem this year, called Christmas, but it's a good place to start. It's midnight and huge white rabbits zigzag the snow-packed road. I shock them along with my high beams. In my mind, I've lowered my window and am thumping the outside of my door with a ball bat. In my mind, I recklessly cut the cookie with the cheese knife. What do white rabbits eat, I wonder? And do they ever sleep, I wonder? I had a problem and I solved it. How I solved it is none of your business. This poem has two different titles. I don't know which it's going to be, right? It's called Ripped, Loose, Ornate, or From Bed. The wind is howling, but also mewling. I lie in bed, shaking thoughts violently in my mind like a rag doll I love, but whose head is getting loose. I have loved you so much, your head fell off, says the child, kneeling. Ornate, wicker feelings rip free and tear off down valley. The cabin, half buried in snow. The bed springs, if I were dead, they'd still creak. The blankets could use another. A bruised light through lace curtains. Maybe a baby's finger of bourbon in the bottle. Now something small's just run across me, diagonally, across chest and stopped on stomach, panting, thinking, kneading his or her paws a bit on the topmost pilly, filthy, beware of adjectives blanket. Ripped loose wicker feelings travel back now, up valley. Currently over Kansas. You'd smashed a fairly expensive painting over my head. You were not mad, said not a word. I sat there with my oatmeal before me, head poking through canvas, framed down around shoulders. I'm traveling across this great country sideways, 5 or 6 feet above the ground, probably 75 miles per hour, legs just dangling, not bumping into anything, wearing only a windbreaker. Chunk of sea glass. Becky, I'm typing this in your study. A rainy fall day, no one's home. For some reason I want to type you're in Japan, and I don't know where your man and kid are. Typing man and kid feels a little crass, but it's okay because I've let myself into your house and I'm frail and drunk and a little hungry, looking at a sizable chunk of blue-green sea glass here on your desk, considering the weight it exerts upon the desk and the desk's equal inverse force upon its base. A thunderstorm's just passed through, I type that, and one of your windows is cracked slightly. The study sips the gray, balmy air. Rain drips from cedar branches onto the casing of the hot water heater. The room smells like old books and dust and maybe leather. There's a red wig on a wig rack, a heavy black stapler that feels like a pistol, a water glass with an inch of water in it. Soon, Beck, I'll recline in your recliner, your cat sprawled in my abdomen, making it difficult to nap, but I'll nap. And when I wake, I'll still have the house to myself, I'm sure. And all the browns and beiges and burnt mustards of your study will resume again their quiet work upon me, lifting me groggily along on this lonely, leather-scented journey without you, who may or may not be in Japan, your man or your kid. You should be hearing the sound that a gumball makes. There's a red gumball rolling slowly toward you. A red gumball that can roll uphill, slowly over books or a pile of laundry, doing a load of socks. Rose tantrum. I had this phrase, rose tantrum, in my head for a long time, and I wrote it out on a note card and then lost the note card, then found the note card like months later, and then typed it out, and I didn't know what to do with it, but it was an example of where a phrase just, I knew I wanted to try to do something with rose tantrum. I just like the sound of it. A rose was throwing a tantrum deep in the botanical gardens. An angel fell in the bathroom, knocked her front teeth out on the edge of the toilet. A long-haired dachshund was crossing the Bosphorus. I'm jumping around here. A rose, a tantrum, an angel saying it was the sink. A sign on a dumpster saying unwanted diamonds. But it was the toilet, it was definitely the toilet. The rose shook slightly but violently, like a bruise happening, sound of cable straining. The angel danced all night in a club, music deafening, rum and cokes, carpenter blokes, dried blood on her chin. I fell and smashed these in, she tried saying, pointing to her mouth. On the sink, today at noon, the sink. And I'll read one more, and then we can, I'll take some questions if there are any. Who was the sun? This is kind of would be maybe an obituary for the sun, and we should probably start working on one. So this would be my entry for that. Who was the sun? Before the sun was the sun. The sun was other things. Used car salesman, Bible salesman, door-to-door gourd salesman, circus employee, early orthodontist, warrior, witch, black hole, wind in the grass, snake in the grass, then car salesman again. That was eons ago, before time, actually. Then the sun became the sun, our great enabler, endurance personified, witness, savior, silent partner, savage, stoic, cynic. The sun partied, was a drinker, grew weary, made a comeback, had a heyday, then lost traction, again grew weary, used cars, gourds, and Bibles, enabler, and witness. All right, well, I think I'll stop there and open the floor for...
Earl, who are you reading these days?
Who am I reading? Well, let's see. Recently I kind of, for me, discovered Frank Stanford, this poet. Copper Canyon put out a really, nice, fat, kind of a collected book of poems of his, and I picked that up sometime during the holidays, and I've really been loving that. And what else? I've been reading a lot of these shorter novels, these novellas written by this Argentinian writer Cesar Aira, A-I-R-A, and I've read a couple of those. He's published over 90 books, and he's in his early to mid 60s, and they'd be classed, I guess, as novellas. They're between 90 and 10 or 15 pages. I recently read one called Dinner, which is the newest one, and it's supposed to be, it's kind of a zombie book, but not really. I mean, it's unusual. What else? Yeah, you asked me. Let me. I'll think of some other book.
Well, what journals do you?
You know, I actually do not read a lot. I don't read a lot of literary journals. I just don't. I feel like reading time there's only so much of it, and so when I'm not working, I have these stacks of books. I think I probably read more fiction than I do poetry. In the last 8 or 10 years maybe. But I've also been reading Jim Harrison's his last book, Dead Man's Float, which came out earlier this year, book of poems, which is great. I really recommend that. But as far as the journals, yeah, I just don't read a whole lot of them. Yeah. Sometimes I'll be directed to something, someone will say, you should go check this out, and then I definitely do that. But in terms of getting things delivered to the house and carefully going through journals, I just don't do that. What else?
Do you sometimes think about poems while you're shoeing horses, and do you actually stop and write things down, or do you just kind of remember it for later?
I do. I try to have a notebook. But the thing that it's interesting is horseshoeing is so, it's such a particular, it's a demanding thing. So usually I'm fully engrossed in that. I mean, it really is almost like, where I have more ideas is when I'm driving between stops or traveling or riding my bicycle. Those are the places, like I love riding, bicycling. But as far as shoeing, it's like I turn a corner, like someone just throws a switch, and I almost never have any kind of good ideas when I'm sometimes. But yeah, so I try to. Occasionally, though, I'll think of something and I'll run over and write it down on something and try to get back to it. But yeah, just like shoeing is, we have a couple other farriers in the back row. Good. So, yeah, it's like a separate thing.
You're talking about giving of yourself a lot in all your reading and everything and putting stuff together, but what do you get out of doing this?
Out of writing?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's a good question. Because you have two different things. You have the fruits of the writing, getting something published, getting some kind of recognition, but mainly it's publishing and reading. These things are kind of the after the fact thing. But that's not it at all, because I can sometimes pretty easily feel ambivalent about a lot of that. But so back to that novelist Cesar Ira. A quote that I have typed out on my study wall is he was being interviewed, and he's known to not. I'm getting off track, but I will get back to that. He's known to not be a big reviser. He really wants his pieces to sort of flow quickly and have a light hand. And the interviewer was trying to corner him and say, couldn't you improve your ideas or your plots, or don't you have ideas when you do this or do that, and thinking about things. And this also goes back to having thoughts while shoeing horses. But what he said was, ideas do not come to me in a vacuum, but rather while I'm writing. Which sounds really simple, but to me, I love that, because it's also like E.M. Forster, who said something like, how do I know what I think until I see what I say? Or there's some, there are other people who've said that, but that idea that writing is a way of organizing your thoughts. But this idea that for Cesar Ira, ideas don't come to me in a vacuum, and so and he elaborates a little bit, but that's pretty much it right there. So back to that, for me, writing is this it's like there's a euphoric feeling. It's almost like some kind of a drug that is way better than landing poems in magazines, or all that stuff is so fleeting. And actually, the moment it's over, that stuff is like, that's like corpses, really. After a while, you have books that are published, or things that are done, or poems that are in magazines, but really that's like tending to corpses. Those are all things that it's water under the bridge, it's all in the past. Whereas writing, when you're sitting there working through something, that's like an adrenaline rush. And these are two really separate things. I think most of the time we confuse them. When we think about writers, we think of these things as all bundled together, and they kind of are. But so what do I get out of that is that solitary act of sitting there kind of confused, not knowing where I'm going, sitting at my desk, working with material, is so totally different than all the other stuff, and that's why. And that's why, no magic happens, when you're sitting at the computer sending out packets of poems to people, or even when you're getting good news. If you get good news, there's really not a whole lot of magic there. It's so fleeting. Whereas that other is the rich thing. I think that's what most writers write. Yeah.
Have you written any poems about shooting?
There was maybe in the beginning I was intentionally trying not to, and then it just happens, it just does. I know that a couple books, I have only four books done, but those middle two I think are where most of them are. And then lately a lot of horses pop in, and rural things, animals, and I actually noticed I had 2 greased hogs. I didn't know that in these recent poems. I wasn't even really... So greased hogs pop into my poems a lot. But yeah, there are a few that are very direct about, one, receiving an anvil in the mail, what I ordered an anvil and it was shipped to my house, and I wrote a pretty direct, I think, poem about receiving this anvil. And trimming a blind horse, or a horse that had one eye. I have poems about that. And so yeah, I'd say there are, but I don't know if there's enough to create a collection of them, but they do pop in there. But then I also love to, when I'm traveling, I love to, urban things too just affect me as well. And sometimes, like I heard what sounded like a piano recital coming out of a grate in the floor in Chicago, and stuff like that is just amazing to me. I don't know what it was. I imagined it was a piano lesson or something coming out of a grid in the ground. And so yeah, some of them, but yeah. It's really important to me to try to not. I don't like to know where I'm going when I'm writing, and I don't think I'm alone here. And I think a lot of people feel this way. So when I'm going along and I see where the poem is going, there's this sabotage instinct that pops up where I immediately I feel like that disgruntled family member on the boating trip, and who wants to rock the canoe, go over to Aunt Eloise's canoe and rock the boat a little bit or something. Like when things start to seem formulaic and I can see where I'm going, I want to wreck that. So to sit down and write poems about horseshoeing is just typically it doesn't really occur to me, but sometimes it does happen. Yeah.
finish with the answer?
The anvil poem? Yeah, okay. Let me see. This is, but yeah, there's really no, I think after having just said that, this is a very direct, this anvil was shipped to my boss's residence and it was sitting on his step, but this is also really exciting, to get a new anvil and have, it's just and they don't come all crated up. They typically just come like this. This is how an anvil comes to you. It was waiting for me when I returned, sitting on the back porch in the rain, an anvil with a shipping sticker placed squarely on its face. It's a beauty, let me tell you. Only 100 pounds, but with all the meat where it counts, in the waist, and a sweet spot like that of a coveted Kolschwa. And what a curvaceous horn. Perhaps because it's the purest possession a person can own, the anvil does not depreciate the moment it lands on your doorstep. Without a single moving part, not even the boxing glove is so simple, because you have to swing the boxing glove. The anvil is never swung. A good anvil does not move, ever. It just sits there. You go to it. You stand before it or you step around it. It seems at first that it's all up to you, for you supply the labor, but the anvil rewards you with impact, with rebound, the inverse of your efforts. Your old typewriters can get gummy. Not so with the anvil. Your favorite pipe could be smacked from your mouth. This will never happen with the anvil. From the anvil's many surfaces and edges come loaves of bread, sacks of coffee, your poultry, your beef, your woolens. For an anvil is a workbench across which all your labor must pass humbly, despite the sweat and sporadic bursts of hammer violence. And from that labor, the paycheck, the fruits, some say. Boxing gloves produce no fruit. Even an anchor, have I mentioned the anchor? Even an anchor must be dropped. They call it lowering, and sometimes dragged. How so totally sad is the anchor? Let us take a minute to stop here and pray for this pitiful object. Well, thank you very much for coming to the library on this rainy day.